Good evening. Welcome. It's a great pleasure to have you here this evening. A very, very, very special evening for us here at the Center for the Study of Genocide and Human Rights. Please allow me to introduce myself. Some of you know me, so if you do, especially my students, hi. My name is Nella Navarro, and I am the Associate Director and Director of Education at the Center for the Study of Genocide and Human Rights at Rutgers. It is indeed an incredible privilege to be here tonight to have an event that for us at the center is in a way closing our month-long commemoration for what many of you know is a month of genocide and atrocity awareness. And so I think that this is a really significant event for us to be hosting here, most particularly for its historic, educational, and human nature. As you know, the Center for the Study of Genocide and Human Rights, along with partners that I'm looking forward to thanking, is here welcoming Yokoso.
Thank you.
The Hibakusha Stories Project, but most importantly, a story that many of us are very privileged this evening to be listening to and to be thinking about and talking about for many years to come. Before I say a word of thanks, I'd like to frame this event tonight so that we can understand it best. And I will, of course, then turn it over to my colleague, Professor Jesianka. As you know, this year, 2015, marks the year of the 70 years of the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This evening's event is an important moment for commemoration, for memorialization, for education, and for celebrating the spirit of resilience. This event is part of the work that the Center for the Study of Genocide and Human Rights does to create awareness, to educate, as we like to say with a capital E, to engage with the community and members who have suffered the atrocities that we will be hearing about tonight, and I know many of you have studied this in your classes. But it's also an opportunity for prevention, for learning, and for reaching across the aisles, for crossing boundaries so that we do not have to do this again. This event is an extraordinary opportunity to hear a voice, and I hope that we are able to think about this event in that spirit. The Center for the Study of Genocide and Human Rights is very thrilled to have this opportunity to partner with Gateway Education Manhattan Center, Norway, one of several projects and collaborations that we have had the privilege of having sponsored and collaborated with. This also event must thank our co-sponsors, one of our most important partners, the Division of Global Affairs, an old friend, brother, sister, sibling. The Student Association of Global Affairs, and of course, I would like to thank my director, Alex Hinton, who's sitting in the back, who makes these things happen for us. Jean-Marc Coco, the Director of Division of Global Affairs, Ann Martin, and many of the students who are here today. I'll name a few: Lynette, Elsie, Syrianit. Thank you so much. Before I turn this over to Natalie, I would like to once again say, Yokoso, please welcome to our humble abode. And I'd like to begin with a poem. It's a poem that has been written about this event, and it's called Atomic Sky is Falling. With Hiroshima eyes, I weep for a world self-destructing, never learning lessons from the apocalypse of skies falling. With Nagasaki ears, I listen of the woeful cries of more and more victims, each one muted by preemptive destruction. With Bikini and Murora lips, I mourn so many stories unheard, untold, a legacy of catastrophe, buried by tolls of coral. With Nevada skin, I burn to tell a truth obstructed of desolate earth and people. United by a cataclysmic ending, With Lop nor legs I run to find a secret crevice, where I lie hidden from a home on the brink of nuclear precipice. With Novaya Zemlya and Chernobyl arms, I reach to embrace an untainted vision, a reality not beholden since before the Trinity explosion. Unlike Pokhran and Shagai, I cannot celebrate a new era of annihilation, concealed in formidable disguise, justifying my security by threatening our demise. This poem was written in honor of those whose lives were lost and those who continued to this day to think about those days 70 years ago. Again, I would like to thank, in particular, Natalie Jasionka, my colleague and friend, for organizing such an extraordinary event. And most importantly, I would like to take this opportunity to ask all of you to say welcome to our guests who are here to tell their story. Welcome.
Welcome.
Natalie.
Thank you, Nella, for those powerful remarks. I want my classes and Dr. Hinton's classes and Nella's classes to be here today and to share in really making history in a lot of ways. In our classes, we talk about what's going on in the world beyond these walls. What's happening in Fukushima, what's happening in Nepal, right? What's happening in Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, places that seem very far, but we also talk about things that are close to home. Today's event is meant to get you thinking about why these issues really matter and how they actually impact you in your everyday life. Now, you might not think that history in this way can affect you, right? But in fact, we need to start talking about what's happened in the past, otherwise we're doomed to repeat it, as it is always said. I want you guys to think about how these issues, how these stories are still happening right now around the world in many different ways, and why your generation needs to care, why we actually need to give a damn. We're very much on our smartphones, we're very much isolated in our own worlds, but what's happening out there matters to us, even within these walls of the university. So I'm very excited to share some activism, share some stories and narratives, have you guys engage and ask questions. Without further ado, I'd like to present hibakusha stories. Thank you so much for joining us.
Good evening, everyone. I feel so incredibly moved by the introduction. My name is Kathleen Sullivan, and my job is to frame these conversations in exactly the way that you all have just framed the evening. So I feel like my work is done. Although I like to do a little something interactive so that we're not just passively listening. Not that listening isn't important, but we want to engage you in exactly what Natalie just said, which is to make what many people feel as an abstract issue, the nuclear issue, to become personal to ourselves, to become our own personal story. We all live in the nuclear age, and I'm sure many of you have heard the phrase by Albert Einstein, with the splitting of the atom, everything has changed except our way of thinking. And what we aim to do in hibakusha stories is to help us engage a new way of thinking so that we can feel drawn to take action for disarmament. And in taking action for disarmament, we are taking action for our survival. We're taking action for the survival of our planet. We're taking action for the survival of future generations. So it's a very powerful message, and I feel extremely privileged to be able to bring to you this evening the stories, two personal narratives. The one is a story of, and I'm just going to briefly introduce them to you now, Kristen Iverson. Kristen is a creative writer. She's a professor of writing at University of Cincinnati. She's just written, or has a book that was written a while ago but has had a lot of life called Full Body Burden, which is about Rocky Flats. And Rocky Flats is part of the U.S. nuclear weapons assembly line. And Kristen will give about a 20-minute story of her experience. And then we will turn over to the extraordinary Setsuko Thurlow, who is a Hiroshima survivor. And I think that it really is important for us to recognize that we are among the last people who will receive these stories firsthand. We will receive these stories, and then it is our responsibility to share these stories in the future and to pass them on, and hope that no other human beings will have the experience of those survivors from Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So I'm Kathleen Sullivan. I work with the Hibakusha Stories Project. We're also joined this evening by Carolina Soto, who is another one of our team members. And for 3 weeks now, during the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty, which is occurring right now at the United Nations, the review conference happens once every 5 years. We'll be hosting 10 atomic bomb survivors to go into mostly high schools. So this is a really wonderful event for us to be engaging in university and community members. So I just want to start with a brief interactive exercise. I'd like to invite you to turn to the person next to you. This will make sense. Just turn to the person next to you for a minute, and I'm going to time you, and share what it is that you love about being alive. And I'd like you to take it in turns and really use this opportunity to be specific. You know, the detail is where we're looking for detail. So just for a couple of minutes, turn to the person next to you and just simply share what it is that you love about being alive, the people you love, the art, the music. You know, I walk past here, you've got the Center for Study of Jazz History. I mean, you know, those particular people who inspire us with their genius. So just share back and forth, and then we'll come back to the big group when I ring this bell. Okay? So just share back and forth for a minute. Have a go at wondering why that kind of activity might be relevant to discussing nuclear weapons today. Anyone? Why do you think we want to identify what it is we love about being alive? Go ahead.
Because it could be taken away from you.
That's right. So, in looking at how to move from this abstraction, this idea that nuclear weapons are something that have to do with nation states, that have to do with scientists, that have to do with politicians, it's really just too big for me to engage. When we think about what we love, very specifically the people, the places, the art, the music, the literature, and recognize that everything we love is threatened by the existence of nuclear weapons every moment of every day. Right now, there are in excess of 5,000 nuclear weapons owned jointly between the United States and Russia that are on hair trigger alert. They're ready to launch in 2 to 5 minutes. Those weapons are being controlled by human beings and machines that humans have made. Quick poll, how many of you have made a mistake in the last week? Just raise your hands. Okay, good. How many of you have made a mistake in the time since you woke up this morning? Okay, so we learn by making mistakes. We understand the world by making mistakes. But we have also created machines that we cannot make mistakes with, and we have done. I'd like to commend to you a book by Eric Schlosser called Command and Control. It's a recently published book. It is about the preponderance of nuclear weapons accidents in this country over the last 70 years. And if you don't believe in some sort of divine intervention, you will after you read this book. It is extraordinary that we have not witnessed a nuclear detonation by accident from our own nuclear weapons developed from our own tax money, developed from our own ingenuity, happening and deployed on our own land. That's the insanity of deterrence. And I think that's why Kristen's story is particularly relevant, because nuclear weapons, we've been told, have kept the peace. But nuclear weapons have robbed us of our intelligence. They have robbed us from the public purse when we are desperate for things in our society that need fixing immediately. And they have contaminated our own earth and our own national region, if we want to throw up those kind of boundaries. And so we're waging a war already before any weapon has ever been fired. We have contaminated our earth, we've contaminated our own bodies under the guise of protecting us, which is false. I like the name of the Center for the Study of Genocide and Human Rights, because when we think of nuclear weapons, we really should not call them weapons. We should call them instruments of genocide, instruments of omnicide, instruments that create instantaneous death on a scale that none of us can imagine except Setsuko, who's sitting in this room with us tonight, and a slow death caused by radioactive poisoning and radioactive contamination, which many of us cannot understand. With a view to that, I'd like to offer a sound demonstration for us to imagine the firepower of the world's nuclear arsenal. And this is a very, well, we're using this in the spirit of Albert Einstein, who said imagination is more important than knowledge, because we first have to imagine something before it is created. And sometimes we have to use our imagination in order for things not to happen. So, two sounds. The first is the sound of one BB dropping into the tin. That, for our sound demonstration, our imagination exercise, represents the total firepower of the Second World War. So, again, in the high school workshop, we would flesh this out with the students, but we can imagine together the total firepower of the Second World War represents all the bullets, all the bombs, all the torpedoes, all the grenades, all the landmines. The two new nuclear weapons used in Hiroshima and Nagasaki represented with the sound of one BB dropping into the tin. And that's roughly about 3 megatons of explosive force. So we know how devastating the Second World War was. Every time you hear one BB dropping into the tin, that represents the firepower of one World War II, 3 megatons of explosive force. The second sound is the equivalent sound, with each BB representing one World War II, of the world's nuclear arsenal. That's the 16,000 nuclear weapons owned by those 9 nations that we just identified. This does not include the bullets, the cluster bombs, the torpedoes, the grenades, the other god-awful things that we've invented. This is the representation of the world's nuclear arsenal 70 years after Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So in order to engage your imagination, I'd like to invite you to close your eyes. And remember that each single BB represents one World War II, as we listen to the sound of today's nuclear arsenal 7 decades after Hiroshima and Nagasaki. You can open your eyes. So would anyone like to say any feelings that they have that come up for them when hearing that sound? Any emotion or feeling?
It's kind of chilling. I mean, all I heard was just like, that.
So most students report feeling afraid when they hear that, or that it went on so long. Any other feelings? So with the view to having this conversation this evening about making this issue personal to us, I invite you to stay with those feelings, and we'll come back to that after the Q&A and look at that again. The poem that was read was extraordinary because through the narratives of Kristen and Setsuko, we have both Nagasaki and Hiroshima in the room. Nagasaki was a plutonium weapon, Hiroshima a uranium weapon, and the insanity of the nuclear arms race will be explained through the eyewitness of Kristen Iverson in her extraordinary book, which I commend to you. And after Kristen speaks for about 20 minutes, we will invite Setsuko up to share her personal narrative. And I'd like to introduce Setsuko a little bit more at that time. But thank you so much for your attention. And again, it's just an extraordinary honor to be in this room with you all this evening. So I'd like to invite now Kristen Iverson, who will be speaking to you about full body burden. Kristen.
I need my technical help if
Yes,
anything
yes.
is wrong. Okay, great. Great. Well, thank you so much for having me here today. I'm going to talk a little bit about what some people have called the American hibakusha, what happened in this country, and how the bombs were built and manufactured. And it's been a great privilege of mine to be able to speak with hibakusha, and it's been powerful for me to kind of see the whole story of what happened in my own backyard in Colorado at Rocky Flats and how this ties into this broader narrative. The title of my book is Full Body Burden, Growing Up in the Nuclear Shadow of Rocky Flats. Has anybody here heard of Rocky Flats? One person. The title, or the word body burden, the term body burden, you may be familiar with it. It refers to the amount of radioactive material present in a human body, which acts as an internal and ongoing source of radiation. And this is important to keep in mind. Plutonium is dangerous in a number of different ways. If you get it into the body through a cut or a wound, it's dangerous. If you drink it or ingest it in some way, it's dangerous. One of the most dangerous ways, the most dangerous way to be exposed to plutonium is through the lungs. A very tiny particle of plutonium, if it lodges in the lungs, acts as an internal and ongoing source of radiation for 200 years or more, obviously beyond human lifespan. And that's part of the reason why we saw so much cancer in my neighborhood where I grew up. I'm going to begin just briefly with these photos of the bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We developed these bombs, and this was the only use of nuclear weapons for warfare in history. The bombs were, I'm sure you're familiar with the Manhattan Project and all of that. After this point in history, production of nuclear weapons went to Rocky Flats. The bombs were designed at Los Alamos. They were built at Rocky Flats, 3 miles from my childhood home. Secretly, we had no idea that that's what was going on there. Rocky Flats, the nuclear weapons plant, and this is a shot of the primary plutonium production facility. Secret operations began in 1952, before I was born. The plant was owned by the Atomic Energy Commission, now the Department of Energy, and it was operated by Dow Chemical. When I was a kid and the plant was operated by Dow Chemical, the rumor in my neighborhood was that they were making household cleaning supplies.
My mother thought for years that they were making scrubbing bubbles. They were not making scrubbing bubbles. What I've done with the presentation tonight, and this is true for my book as well, is I've woven my own personal story and what happened to my family and friends and coworkers, and also briefly the history of Rocky Flats, and then the broader picture of the Cold War. So in 1958, when I was born, my family left Des Moines, Iowa, where I was born, and we moved to Colorado. And I understand there's some Scandinavians in the room. My mother's Norwegian, my father is Danish, and we had farms in Iowa and Minnesota. My father decided that he did not want to continue the family tradition on the farm and wanted to become a lawyer. He went to law school. We moved to Colorado, where my parents wanted to start a new life. So they bought a house in Arvada, Colorado, which is just a little ways outside of Boulder, a very beautiful part of the country, as Kathleen mentioned. Just a few miles from Denver and a few miles from Boulder. And the mountains are right there. It's very beautiful. That's me sitting in the middle there. My sisters Karin and Karma. We all had Norwegian names. And then when my brother Kurt was born, we moved to a larger house just 3 miles from Rocky Flats. And we had no idea that it was there. And this is a picture taken from our first house right before we moved. I had the kind of childhood where my mother would put us out in the morning, and we had horses, we had dogs, we were outside all the time, hiking, swimming in the lake. And then my mother would say, come back at supper time. So it was a wonderful way to grow up. But what we did not know was that the environment had been contaminated before I was even born with plutonium, americium, tritium, carbon tetrachloride, and a number of other radioactive and toxic elements. So this is what Rocky Flats looked like from our back porch. You can see the water tower there. We didn't know what was going on. Again, it was operated by Dow Chemical. We thought they were making cleaning supplies. This is a shot of the entrance to Rocky Flats in 1961. Rocky Flats operated in total secrecy. There was no requirement to tell local people what was going on, whether or not it was dangerous. And that continued for a very long time. Even after RCRA and the Clean Water Act, Rocky Flats was allowed to operate without any environmental regulation. Rocky Flats was not producing scrubbing bubbles. Over the course of 38 years, Rocky Flats produced more than 70,000 plutonium pits or triggers for nuclear weapons. This is what they looked like. This is a button just before it's been machined into the actual trigger. The heart, we made the heart of every nuclear weapon produced in the United States. Each particular one, and again 70,000, each particular one contains enough breathable particles of plutonium to kill every person on Earth. Hanford supplied the plutonium, Oak Ridge supplied the enriched uranium. Once the buttons were machined in Colorado at Rocky Flats, they were sent to the Pantex facility in Texas, where they were encased in conventional explosives and actually became the bomb. And as I said, we produced 70,000 at a cost of roughly $4 million each. In 1989, and I'll get to this a little bit later, in 1989 there was an FBI raid on Rocky Flats. The only time in history of our country that 2 government agencies, the FBI and the EPA, had raided another government agency, the Department of Energy. At that point in time, production of triggers slowed and eventually stopped. It was continued at Los Alamos, which is where it continues to the present day, and we currently produce somewhere between 4 and 7 plutonium pits per year at Los Alamos at a much higher cost than $4 million. Rocky Flats was, we were the factory. Los Alamos was the brains of the weapons design, and at Rocky Flats we were the production facility. Workers were not allowed to talk about their work to anyone. If you can imagine working at a plant for 30, 35 years and coming home every day and not being able to tell your family what you did all day. That's what people in my neighborhood and my community did. Workers in one part of the plant were not allowed to share information with other workers. So you had people who didn't know what other people were doing at the plant. This is what Rocky Flats looked like from above, from an airplane, Eventually, there were more than 880 buildings at Rocky Flats. Many of them were underground. You could see nothing from the road. I just want to briefly point out, you see those three black squares there? Those are solar evaporation ponds. We had so much plutonium at Rocky Flats that we couldn't control it. We didn't know what to do with it. That was an effort to allow material to evaporate into the air. It was not entirely successful. One of the things that they did with material from the solar ponds, and I talk about this in my book, I don't have time to go into it in detail tonight, but they created a product called pondcrete, which is when you take plutonium and you mix it with cement in an attempt to stabilize it. And when I worked at Rocky Flats myself eventually, when I worked at Rocky Flats, this was something that the workers talked about quite a bit because it never gelled. It was like plutonium jelly. We had thousands of one-ton blocks of this plutonium jelly. Many of them stood out in the open because we didn't have enough room to store them, and they disintegrated and leaked into the ground and the water. But some of the pondcrete came from those ponds. I want to show you some pictures of glove boxes of what workers did at Rocky Flats. They would put their arms and hands into lead-lined gloves, and this is where they would actually machine and work with the plutonium buttons. This is what a glove box line looks like. Workers stood on two levels, somewhere below, somewhere above. They would put their arms into these things, and if you see at the top there's a conveyor belt, and the plutonium buttons were moved down the line. It was just like a factory, and they were machined all the way down. Now, one of the problems that we had at Rocky Flats was that safety was not number one. The most important thing at Rocky Flats was production above everything. And so there were a lot of problems with respect to safety, and there were a lot of fires. Plutonium is highly flammable. It catches fire very easily, especially when you're shaving it and machining it. And it's very difficult to stop a plutonium fire. You can't use water on plutonium without risking a criticality or a nuclear chain reaction. So when workers were working with the glove boxes, if something started on fire, they would take a little bit of sand to snuff it out. But of course, as you can see, and I think I have another picture here, these glove boxes were in long serpentine lines, and if there was a fire and it was not controlled, it would go through that entire line, and that's where we really got into trouble. There were more than 200 fires at Rocky Flats over the years. There was never any public warning, no public evacuation, no information available to the public. There were two big fires that I'm going to talk about briefly. One in 1957, right before I was born, and another one in 1969. So here are a couple more shots of the glove boxes. This is one that has not been used yet. You can get a sense of how the hands reach in to work with the material. One thing I do want to mention as we go along is it wasn't just local residents who were contaminated, but many, many workers have been contaminated in the process of making nuclear weapons. So from the very beginning, the Department of Energy, the Atomic Energy Commission before that, Rockwell, Dow Chemical, and EG&G, which is a company that operated Rocky Flats when I was working there, continuously denied that there was anything being done at Rocky Flats that was dangerous to the public or that triggers were being made there. And yet, there were a lot of things happening at Rocky Flats. Rocky Flats was and is a nuclear waste storage site. We had so much plutonium and radioactive waste at Rocky Flats that storing it was a huge problem. A lot of material was stored inside these buildings, like this building here. And here's a shot of workers at Rocky Flats checking barrels, moving material between the barrels. And we had so much material that some of these barrels were stored outside. Thousands of barrels were stored out on this open site here, and this is called the 903 pad if you're interested in researching this. And just to give you a sense of perspective, my house, my childhood home, is about 3 miles off this corner here. And we used to ride our horses up on that levee there. So what happened with these 5,000 barrels? They rusted out. and a lot of material was released into the soil and the groundwater and was carried off-site. And again, the public was not informed. Another problem at Rocky Flats was the incineration of radioactive and toxic materials. This is an incinerator that was attached to Building 771, the primary plutonium production building. This particular incinerator burned radioactive waste, plutonium-related materials and plutonium, and it was released into the air and traveled over the Metro Denver area, over my neighborhood in Arvada, and then south over Metro Denver. This is a shot of where the fire started for the 1957 fire. That fire was so big and so extreme, it burned out that entire building and burned out the filters. Do I have a shot of, yes, here, but the filters, these filters had not been changed in 4 years, so there was a lot of plutonium caught up in them. And the fire was so extreme that it burned through the measuring equipment, so we will never know exactly how much material escaped during that particular fire. Plutonium was detected in a school playground 12 miles away. That was my elementary school. 2 years after this fire, we saw a big jump in childhood leukemia and cancer in the Metro Denver area. This is a map of that 1957 fire, the plume that traveled over the Metro Denver area, 1957 and 1969. And just to give you an idea of perspective, if you can see the word Arvada there, you see where where that A is right where my house is. So now I just want to briefly show you some family pictures. This is a picture that I'm sure many families have. This was taken around the time that we moved out to our house that was closer into Rocky Flats. This is a picture of us with one of our horses, Tonka, and I may have another picture, no. Tonka, the first love of my life. And as I said, we grew up on horses and rode them all around the area. And this land here falls within the second contamination zone around the plant. We didn't know that. And this is a map of contaminated residential areas around Rocky Flats. This is based on Department of Energy information. My house is just kind of on the edge of the lake there. The sediment of that lake is contaminated with plutonium. So beginning in the 1970s and 1980s in particular, people began to notice things with their animals. This is a farmer who lived in my neighborhood, Lloyd Mixon. He had horses and cows, pigs, he had chickens. The chicks he had chicks who couldn't peck their way out of the shell. He had horses that were born with deformities and cows. This is a little pig Scooter who was born with no back legs, and he would go to public meetings with politicians and community meetings and things like that and he would say, tell us what is happening at Rocky Flats. Tell us what's going on. Things are happening. We're seeing it in the animals. Cattle near Rocky Flats showed a high level of plutonium in the lungs, higher than at the Nevada test site. We also see plutonium to the present day in the bodies of deer, rabbits, groundhogs, all sorts of animals out there. And I'll come back to the groundhog situation in a moment. 5 minutes, okay. So I'm giving you a lot of information very quickly, but let me just say all of these maps and photos that I'm showing you, many of them are on my website and they're available in various places. So there are all sorts of places to look for more information. I just want to touch on some of the activism that went on at Rocky Flats. It began in the 1980s. These are people who camped on the tracks to attempt to stop the trains from carrying radioactive material in and out of the plant. Daniel Ellsberg was one of the activists out there. Do you all know who Daniel Ellsberg is? Yeah. Okay. So one of your assignments is to go home and look that up. He's probably most well known for the Pentagon Papers. He worked for the Rand Corporation and the Vietnam War and all of that. And then he's always been very supportive of Rocky Flats and just getting information out to the public so that people know what's going on there, what has happened there. Poet Allen Ginsberg, beat poet Allen Ginsberg, was also an activist at Rocky Flats, and this is a shot of him. There were protests, but at that point in time, even then, we still didn't know exactly what was going on at Rocky Flats. What this young woman doesn't know at this protest is that she is sitting with her children on land that is contaminated. And here's a shot of one of the protests. So, now to come back to a little bit more of the personal story very briefly. I was a graduate student at the University of Denver. I had 2 small children. I needed a job while I was in school, and I decided to go to work at Rocky Flats. I knew lots of people who worked at Rocky Flats, my friends' parents. We didn't really know what went on there. It was considered one of the best jobs in town, good salary, flexible hours, all that sort of thing. So I went to work at Rocky Flats, and to tell you briefly what happened, I was there for about a year. And I was a technical writer and level 3 administrative assistant. I worked preparing reports with project engineers and project managers, preparing reports that went to Washington, D.C. and Albuquerque. And I came home from work one day and turned on the television that night, and there was a Nightline program on Rocky Flats. They were interviewing my manager and other people that I worked with. And that was the first point in time that I learned how dangerous the plant was, what was really being manufactured there, the legacy of Rocky Flats, and the fact that I was working next to 13.2 metric tons of plutonium, much of it unsafely stored. That, I'll never forget that night. I thought, how could I grow up next to this plant, live in this community, and work at this plant and not know all this was going on? My neighbors didn't know, my family didn't know, none of us knew. That was the day that I knew I would quit, and the day that I quit was the day I knew I would write a book. 10 years of research and writing went into this book, though I wasn't aware at that time that it would take so much work to finish it. So I'm going to just quickly summarize here. This is what Rocky Flats looked like when I was working there. These are some of the people in my life I just want to touch upon. Department of Energy Manager Charlie Wolf was a Rocky Flats employee. He worked in some of the hot areas with his employees. I knew him well. He contracted brain tumors. There are some very common illnesses that we see among workers and also for people who live in Colorado in that area. Leukemia, lymphoma, thyroid cancer, thyroid issues, and brain tumors in particular. He developed brain tumors and passed away in 2009. Worker Laura Schultz worked on the line. She was one of the few women who worked directly on the hotline. She's had many, many illnesses, and she's still with us. And when she is healthy and able, she goes on the road and does lectures like this where she talks about what has happened to the nuclear workers in this country. Another person I want to mention briefly is local resident Tamara Smith-Meza. She lived just around the corner from us. Her family was is Mormon, and they had an organic garden. And the way I knew her family was that our little pony, Barney, would get out under the fence and sneak over to their organic garden because they had the best stuff over there. And my mother would wake me up in the morning and say, "Chris, go get Barney," and I had to run over there, and then her father would yell at me, "Get your horse out of our garden." So that's my childhood relationship with this family, but of course we were all good friends. And their house was directly downwind from Rocky Flats, directly on Stanley Lake. And one difference between our two families was that my father tried to dig a well, we never got water. Her family had a well, and they were drinking that water and watering their garden with the water that came up directly from that water table. So Tamara was not expected to survive her first bout with brain tumors, which is what this photo is from. Just this last November, she had surgery for her 9th brain tumor. Her doctors in Colorado and New York have no doubt that her illness is connected to Rocky Flats exposure. And she's still with us. She's the most incredible, one of the most incredible people I know. So much of her brain has been removed that she can't do basic things like set a table or walk across a room, but her linguistic skills are intact, so she's very articulate about her experience. This shot of her in 2008. And I'm going to move quickly now to the so-called cleanup at Rocky Flats. There has not really been a cleanup. Most people refer to it more as a cover-up. It's a 6,000 acre site. 1,300 acres of the site are so profoundly contaminated that they can never be open to the public. Plutonium has a half-life of 24,100 years. The rest of that site, 4,000 acres, is slated to open as a national wildlife refuge, open for public hiking and biking and recreation with these levels of contamination still on site. I don't have time to go into the detail. Perhaps we can talk about it a little bit later in Q&A if we have time. But the site is still very dangerous. These are some of the burial sites at Rocky Flats. Many of them still remain. This is what it looks like today, just from the road. There is no sign. Not only is Rocky Flats important in terms of its nuclear legacy and its environmental and health effects, but it's also a very important historical story. We produced, it was the heart of the Cold War production in this country. And it's a story that we must not forget. We're building new homes next to Rocky Flats, and the issue of contamination continues to the present day. About a year and a half ago, we had a big flood in Colorado. You may have read about it in the news. This is what the Rocky Flats site looked like. There was plutonium transfer in the water off-site into local neighborhoods. This is what a local neighborhood looked like. When that water evaporates, those plutonium particles are resuspended into the air. So this is not just something that happened in the 1940s or 1950s or 1980s. This is an ongoing issue in very many ways. And I'm going to conclude with just a couple of shots of activists who are currently speaking at the plant. These people are protesting the dog park. Out at the plant, the dogs have been found to have excessive cancer in their paws in this area. And so I know that was a lot of information very quickly, so I'm going to end there so we can get on to the next part of the story. But the story of Rocky Flats is important in so many ways. And one of the most important ways, the most important way in which it's important is that it connects with the story that you are about to hear. What we produced here in this country at Los Alamos and Rocky Flats affected me, my family, everyone I knew in my life, and most significantly it affected people like Setsuko. Thank you very much.
I'm going to invite Setsuko to come up. Setsuko Thurlow has been engaged in raising consciousness and encouraging and inspiring action for disarmament for the whole of her adult life. She was, as a profession, chose the profession of social work and has received numerous honors, including the Order of Canada, which is the highest honor for Canadian civilians, for her work for disarmament. And most recently, she has been nominated in this year, 2015, for the Nobel Peace Prize. I think that it's difficult sometimes to listen to the survivor testimony. Imagine how difficult it is for Setsuko to share her experience. She recounts these memories which stir her emotionally. All of us can identify with the fact that retelling painful experiences brings up those emotions for us. So the hibakusha risk their personal comfort to tell us their stories, not to elicit sympathy from us, but to motivate us to work to abolish nuclear weapons. And that is Setsuko's message, and it is such an exceptional honor to work with this courageous and brilliant woman. So let us welcome Setsuko.
I am delighted to be here at this school. One of the reasons for that is two of my best friends in Toronto, Canada, belong to this campus. Dr. Ralph Garber used to be the Dean of the Faculty of Social Work. Do you know him? No? Does anybody know him? Anyway, I can hardly wait to go back to Toronto and say, well, I visited your school. So, I am delighted to be here. Excuse me, I'm sorry, I am sitting. I don't think I can keep standing for half an hour. So, the people who are standing outside, do come in. I hope you can hear me. I don't hear very well, but I can talk loud. In 1954, I graduated from university in Japan. Then I was offered a scholarship to come to the United States. I accepted it, and I came to Virginia, just about 3 hours drive from Washington, D.C. And that was August 1954. And they were very curious. In that college town in Virginia, I guess they have never had Japanese students. So when they heard somebody who survived the bombing was coming into that college town, so there was a kind of a press conference. And 1954 is a special year. That was the year United States tested the biggest hydrogen bomb at the Bikini Atoll in Marshall Islands. So people in Japan was really upset, not only in Hiroshima, not only in Nagasaki, but now the Bikini people. The environment was so badly damaged, and people became sick, covered with the ashes of death, they called it, and the catch of the fish had to be destroyed. They were not edible, and Japanese fishermen became sick, and one of them died. So Japanese people are saying, well, this is the third time. When is the United States going to wake up to the reality? They are killing the people and damaging the environment. And that's the time I arrived in Virginia. So the media people interviewed me, and asked for my opinion about Americans' continuing test. And I was young, very honest, naive, and I told them what I thought. United States should stop such horrible thing as testing. And then next day I started receiving unsigned hate letters. You go home where you came from, who is giving the scholarship, and all kinds of threatening things was written in the unsigned letter. Well, I just arrived to the United States a few days ago, so the college president has to protect me by not allowing the postmistress to deliver those letters to me directly, and those things have to go to the president. And I couldn't go to the classrooms, and one of the professors gave me his nice quiet home in the forest, and next several days I was all alone. I did the soul searching. What do? I just arrived in the United States. They tell me to go home, but I can't go home. I just arrived. How am I going to survive in this society? Am I going to be honest and tell them what experience I had? Or am I going to pretend? It was a very lonely, traumatic time. But to make a long story short, I came out of that week feeling more strongly committed to be honest and share horrible experience I have had as a child in Hiroshima. Not because I need your sympathy, but because I wanted to warn you people, the people of the world, to know exactly what happened and what worse fate could be waiting for the rest of the people. People have to be wakened up to the reality of living in nuclear age. This is why it's not fun for me to remember those painful moments and days, but I am committed to share my experience. I came to New York last week, partly because of the hibakusha program, which take us to schools and share our experience. But in addition, this time there was special things happening in New York. Dr. Sullivan has already mentioned about the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference, which is taking place at the United Nations. 190 member states delegates, as well as the delegates of the non-governmental organizations are there, talking about how to control the situation. They have been spending time and discussing the issue year after issue. Since that treaty came into power, it's been 45 years, but we haven't made the progress. We are still stuck with this problem unsolved. It's about time we really have to get moving and find the solution and protect the people. You know, in the name of national security, those countries which own the nuclear weapon are saying those weapons are good because they protect us. They are horrible stuff, but still they are useful. Well, as someone who experienced the war, this destruction by that weapon, I think their excuses are nonsense. It's illusion and delusion, and to say they help us. They kill us. So anyway, that's why I'm here, and I was given the opportunity to speak to the government delegates for a short while. On behalf of the survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, I made the strongest appeal. Perhaps it was a demand that they get busy and they get rid of the nuclear weapons, ban the nuclear weapon. We need a legally binding instrument to control the weapon. It's a human life which counts, which is most important. Anyway, I'm glad that had happened, and many people told me they were happy that I was able to speak on behalf of all the survivors whose dream has been the abolition of nuclear weapons in their lifetime. But many have been dying without their dream fulfilled. I was at the meeting where the German students are meeting this morning, and one of the students wished me success, that my dream will come true. That is, in my lifetime, the abolition, banning the nuclear weapon could take place. Let's all hope that. Now, about my personal experience, I was a 13-year-old grade 8 student in 1945. You know, Japan stupidly started that war by attacking Pearl Harbor. That was a horrible thing. But about a year or so, Japan started losing so badly, and by 1941, no, I'm sorry, that's when the war started. But by 1945, Japan was practically finished. Most of the naval ships have been sunk, and the airplanes have been destroyed. So hundreds of thousands of Japanese soldiers who were deployed at these islands in the South Pacific, they were actually starving because all the transport naval ships have been sunk. They had no way of sending their foodstuff to feed those soldiers. No munitions available. And back at homeland, the clothing and food, everything was rationed. But in 1945, we were practically eating everything. Rice cooked with the vegetables, the even grass. Oh, I long for the day when I can have the white rice and some sweets. And April of that year, Americans captured Saipan and Tinian Islands in the South Pacific. And those islands were closely located to Japan. So once they completed the airfields, their plane could come overnight, during the day and night. They started the carpet bombing of most of the major cities. April 1st, I think, that was the night that Tokyo was attacked. Indiscriminate bombing of the entire city. I read somewhere 360,000 conventional weapons were dropped. And overnight, 100,000 citizens were killed in Tokyo. Then the next big city, Osaka and Nagoya and so on, most of the major cities had been bombed. Hiroshima was considered, our city of Hiroshima was considered as the 10th largest city. So we knew our turn was getting near and we were getting ready. City wanted to widen the street to use them as the fire, what do you call it? Fire
bombing.
lanes.
Escape route?
something like that. That's right.
Fire
So,
lanes.
fire lanes, that's right. So the adults volunteered, destroyed the houses in certain area, but most of the able-bodied young people were fighting at the war, so we children were mobilized to do various jobs. On August 6, 1945, the very day of the bombing, about 7,000 or 8,000 grade 7 and 8 students from all the high schools were mobilized to that center part of the city, and they were clearing the area, just moving the timbers and so forth away. And the explosion took place. The temperature in the center of the explosion was over 1,000,000 degrees Celsius, I understand. But that big fireball came down very quickly down to the ground level where people were walking or working. So high school students are working there of 4,000 degrees Celsius. Those human beings who were working in that part of the city simply melted, vaporized, or carbonized. So from my own school, about 351 students were there. My own sister-in-law was there supervising the students, and legally, and she's still missing. She never came back. We never found her body. Well, I wasn't there. That's why I'm alive today. I was at the Army headquarters, and I was on the second floor of the wooden building, which was 1.8 kilometers away from the ground zero. That was Monday morning, and at 8 o'clock in the morning, Major Yanai, who was in charge of our students, was giving us the pep talk. You people had excellent training. Now you can act as a full-fledged assistant for decoding the secret messages. Can you imagine 13-year-old child were dealing with the top secrets like 3 American naval ships was coming up north toward Japan. You can imagine how desperate Japan was. Japan was really finished in the war. Well, and he said, this is the very day you start working, and this is the day you prove your patriotism for your emperor. We said, yes, sir, we'll do our best. And at that moment, I saw the bluish white flash outside the window. And then I had the sensation of floating up in the air. You see, the powerful blast flattened all the buildings in the city, and obviously the building I was in was collapsing. Together with that, my body was falling. I don't know how long I lost my consciousness, but when I regained the consciousness in the total darkness and the silence, I knew I was faced with death, because I tried to move my body, but I couldn't. I was pinned under the collapsed building. I wasn't upset. It's very strange. There were many strange things I experienced, but one of the strangest things was that I was so calm and serene. Maybe something must have happened to my brain function or psyche. I was very calm, I remember. I just said to myself, this is it, I'm going to die. Then I started hearing faint whispering voices of the girlfriends around me. In the darkness I heard, "Mother, help me, I am here. God, help me." Those voices still ring in my ears. Then all of a sudden, the male voice said, as he shook my left shoulder from behind, "Don't give up, keep pushing, keep moving, keep kicking, I'm trying to free you." And you see the sun ray coming through that opening, and move towards it as quickly as possible, crawl. Well, I did that, and I managed to come out. I turned back and looked at the burning building. Yes, the building was already on fire. And I thought of other girls who were with me in the same room. But I could not enter into the flame. Then 2 other girls managed to come out. And although that happened in the morning at 8:15, but by the time I came out, it was as dark as this. It was twilight. It's perhaps because of the smoke and soot, particles, all these things in the air which was rising together, or maybe inside mushroom cloud. And as my eyes got used to the darkness, I began to see some dark moving objects. And they were coming closer to me. They looked like ghosts to me. I say ghost because they didn't look like human beings. Well, first thing I noticed was their hair was just standing up, straight up, skyward. And they were burned, blackened, and swollen, bleeding. Parts of the bodies were missing, and the flesh and skin were hanging from their arms and the other parts of the body. And the soldier said, "You girls join that procession, escape to the nearby hill." So we carefully stepped over the dead bodies and dying bodies, and we escaped to the hillside. But another strange thing I experienced that day was the quietness, silence. You would expect in a situation like that, people would be screaming for help, but that's not what I heard. Just faint voices. They were saying, "Give me water, please, water." Everybody was asking for water. Their bodies were burned by the 4,000 degree Celsius. That kind of heat. They must have been feeling the heat inside the body. Well, we wanted to give the water, we wanted to be useful and helpful, but we have no bucket, no containers for the water. So 3 girls went to the nearby stream, washed the blood off from our bodies, and tore off our blouses, soaked them in the water, and we dashed to those dying people, put the wet cloth over their mouth. They sucked in the moisture, like, and they looked at us and said thank you, and had the last breath. Well, at the foot of the hill we escaped to was a large army training ground, about the size of 2 football fields. That was packed with the dead bodies and severely injured people. Well, I looked around and see if I could find medical doctors or nurses or any other healthcare professionals, but I didn't see any, because they too were killed. Some remaining professionals, I understand, were serving in the other parts of the city, but not where I was, when tens of thousands of people were just agonizing for last breath. But they got no medication, not even water, just a little bit of moisture we were able to offer them. When the darkness fell that night, we 3 girls, together with hundreds of people on the hill, we just sat there and all night watched the entire city burn, feeling numbed from the massive and grotesque death we had witnessed. That was my experience of that very day. Next day, the soldier came around with a megaphone and said, "Is there Setsuko Nakamura here?" So I said, "Here I am." "And your parents are here," the soldier said. It was a surprise. My father left the city early in the morning out to the sea to enjoy fishing, so he survived. And my mother was doing the dishes after breakfast, and she too was buried under the collapsed building, but she was dug out. She escaped to the outside of the city. But my sister, married sister, and her 4-year-old child were on their way to see the doctor, and they're walking over the bridge. By the time I saw them the next day, their bodies were twice and 3 times larger than normal, and I just couldn't identify them as my sister and my nephew. You know, you just couldn't identify if the body belonged to male or female. They were just chunk of meat or flesh. Well, my sister lived for 4 days, and her child did a little longer. But let me explain. Well, I think the largest number of people were killed by the destroyed building. They were caught under the building. And then next largest number of people were burned. But the unique characteristic of nuclear weapon is, as you know, the radioactivity, effects of the radioactive poisoning. And that worked on human beings in a very mysterious way. Some people die immediately, instantaneously. Some people died a week later, a month later, years later. If you have read the story of Sadako and 1,000 Paper Crane, has anybody read that? I think that girl developed the leukemia 9 or 10 years later. And the worst story is, it's been 70 years since that happened, but people are still dying today. The atomic bomb hospital in Hiroshima and Nagasaki are still packed with the dying people. That's the kind of effect the nuclear weapon had. You see, many people who are burned were burned beyond recognition, and even though many of them healed from that, but unfortunately they had very ugly scars. And those people just couldn't go outside. They hid themselves somewhere in the house because they didn't want to be ridiculed by other people. And not only the scar, but somehow radiation must have done to the general health of the people. There was an illness they commonly call the brabio. Some people just didn't have the strength. They were very lethargic. They couldn't continue working for hours. So who would like to employ those people? And some people thought they were lazy because they don't work hard enough. But they had the reason. Something was happening in their bodies. So those people were discriminated for employment. And those girls with the ugly scars, the family said to their sons, don't marry those girls. They would bring deformed babies. Indeed, there were many deformed babies from the women who were pregnant at that time. So the marriage, the young girls in marriageable age, they couldn't marry. And people thought those people would contaminate that poison to the healthy people. So they shunned those people. So employment and housing, marriage, in many ways, the people were discriminated. It was a sad story, but it happened. You see, people who are lucky enough to have friends and relatives outside of the city, they moved out and depended on their care. But the people who are way up in Tokyo or Hokkaido, somewhere else, they didn't have the clear picture of what actually happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. That's why discrimination just continued on. The people who were living around Hiroshima knew exactly what happened, so they could be more readily helpful and supportive. Now, about the sickness, doctors didn't know what to do. There were some surviving doctors, but they didn't know what to do with those patients. If somebody has the high fever, they wondered if they had the scarlet fever. Nobody heard about the nuclear weapon. Now, common symptoms were the loss of hair, internal bleeding, bleeding from the gum, and diarrhea and fever and so forth. Practically everybody who was in the city at that time lost the hair. Now, when my school reopened in October, after they built the shack in the mountain, and we were so happy to be reunited with the surviving classmates. And many of them were coming to school wearing the bonnet. I wondered why. Well, because they were so shy, they wanted to hide their bald heads. You see, in the morning you comb your hair, that chunk of hair come up. I lost part of my hair myself. It came back, thankfully. I can go on and on describing the symptoms and lack of treatment, but let me tell you a couple of things about socio-political condition in which we lived. You see, Hiroshima happened on August 6th. 3 days later, Nagasaki attack. You see, Hiroshima was uranium type, and Nagasaki was attacked by the plutonium type atomic bomb. But on the 8th, according to Japan's calendar, the Russians joined the Allied forces. They started attacking Japan. Although there was on paper a legal relationship, Japan and Russia were supposed to be mutually supportive. But I shouldn't say so Russians, they were Soviet Unions. But the Soviet Union agreed to help Mr. Truman and what's the name of the new Prime Minister of the UK? But anyway, Soviet Union joined the Allied forces. And that was a real shocker to Japan. And on the 15th of August, Japan surrendered. And there is the American myth that atomic bomb shortened the war, and that was necessary and all that kind of American myth. But it wasn't just atomic bombs which ended the war. Soviet Union's joining Allied forces, that had a very important impact on Japanese decision to surrender the war. I'm sorry. The fact you came here signals that my time is limited. But anyway, let me just have 1 minute or so. When Japan surrendered, Japan was occupied by Allied forces, actually about 90% by the US forces. So instead of emperor, General MacArthur became the supreme commander for Japan. He was a top person. We were occupied for 7 years. And Mr. General MacArthur said, I came to Japan to demilitarize Japan and then to democratize Japan. He did some good things, yes. But as far as Hiroshima and Nagasaki were concerned, some terrible thing happened. I think he represented American government's wish that the world should know that the United States succeeded having the huge success by producing that scientifically and engineering triumph of creating powerful new weapon. But something the world should not know, should not find out, was that those new weapons caused terrible, terrible human suffering. That was not to be known. So General MacArthur instructed American soldiers in Japan and started censoring media. The papers were not to talk about the human suffering, just the strength of American engineering. And not only the censorship, but the confiscation. People were so pained by that traumatizing experience. They have to deal with their pain somehow. They kept a diary about making the films, making the photographs, some medical information and so on. All these things which explained human suffering, those things were confiscated. Over 32,000 items in all. They were confiscated from private homes and schools, hospitals. They were shipped back to the United States. Many years later, when Japanese learned about availability of the film, Japanese people negotiated with the American government, but they wouldn't give the film back. So they started a campaign to raise the money so that with that money they could buy the footage of the film back. And they often found their own selves in that film because after the attack, the B-29 plane flew so low, almost to the ground, and they were busy taking the pictures, how successful the bombs were. I do still remember, and when I have the nightmare, I see the huge black monstrous airplane coming down, and I could almost see the pilot's face. And that's how they got the pictures of human suffering. Anyway, I'll quit now. I just started the story, but the time is up.
Setsuko, you can stay there because this is the opportunity for you all to ask questions and give comments to Setsuko and also Kristen. Do you want to come up here? Okay. Do you have water?
Yeah.
So, we wanted to have an opportunity for you all to be able to ask questions, also give your comments, but please do speak up so that Setsuko can hear your voice.
Yeah.
You might even want to use the microphone if that is possible. Go ahead.
Hi, I had a question for you. I just want to know, did anyone in your town take it upon themselves to sue or like gain any monetary sustenance for like what happened for the environment?
That's okay. It's not mine.
Yeah, that, is this turned on?
Yes.
Can you hear me? Okay. That's a great question. The question is, did anyone in my town try to sue or do anything about it? And actually, there are a number of things that occurred. There was a lawsuit by the Sierra Club that was successful with respect to trying to shut down that incinerator that I showed you a picture of. But the most important story, and I'm just going to give you a very brief version of it, there was a class action lawsuit that began the year after the FBI raid, and so this lawsuit began in 1990 on behalf of 13,000 local residents who felt that their health had been impacted negatively by Rocky Flats. And it turns out in this country, I guess the short way to say this is that it's easier to sue for property value than human health issues. And so that eventually turned into a property lawsuit. It took 20 years for that class action lawsuit to wind its way through the courts. On February 14th, 2006, the best Valentine's Day I ever had, a jury decided in favor of those 13,000 residents and awarded us a great deal of, it was a large settlement. My family was not eligible to get any money from the case because my parents had already sold the home at that point. Even though they'd owned it for more than 20 years, we were outside of the parameters of the lawsuit. But I was on the phone with my sister and we just burst into tears because for us it was a moral victory. It was that they had finally recognized what had happened and recognized the truth of what had happened. Unfortunately, 2 years later, that decision was overturned in the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals by 3 federal court judges in Denver. And it was overturned on a technicality in the judge's instructions to the jury. It was not overturned because the information in the case was inaccurate. It was overturned on a technicality. Just about less than a year ago, this lawsuit, it's Cook v. Rockwell, if you're interested in looking it up, it went before the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court declined to review it and gave us very little explanation as to why they declined it. That's where it stands now. I think that, I don't know what's going to happen with that lawsuit. A lot of those people have died or moved away. I think that, and I hope that there's a new lawsuit building because there are so many people sick in that area, and it's a generational thing. It's not just me, it goes, on to the further generations. It's something that's carried on, and I think it's just a matter of time before we have another lawsuit, and I hope with time it will also become easier to prove the direct link between these illnesses like leukemia, lymphoma, brain tumors, and all of that, and radioactivity and plutonium. It's like the tobacco industry 30 years ago when the tobacco companies used to say, oh, there's no link. There's a link, and I think we'll be able to prove it eventually. So that's where things stand now. Thanks.
Do you have the same health issues?
Can you, sorry.
It's okay.
There we go.
Do you have the same health issues years later amongst the people in the area as you have a more raw form of it, but that was an explosion in your area? Do you have the same, like the cancers and tumors and all that?
Yes.
It's all the same. Okay.
Yes.
And second part question, how are the odds of things, I appreciate your fighting for stopping this and the banning, but how are the odds of it actually happening? Like, how are the results?
What are the odds of a ban succeeding?
Right.
Yeah. What are the odds for disarmament? What's your feeling about, are we going to be able to do this?
Yeah, do things look in your favor?
Well, I feel hopeful right now. The people and even the nation around the world are coming up with many different ways of achieving the ban, and depending on the discussion which is taking place at the United Nations now, is that last 4 weeks. So by the end of that 4 weeks, I suppose those proposed ideas would take, well, form and shape. Maybe she's more articulate to discuss that. Maybe you can explain that. But you know, in years and years, well, I have been talking to a lot of people about this issue. But I am very excited right now because the majority of the people of the world and majority of non-nuclear weapon states are saying enough is enough. We have waited for 70 years. And those nuclear weapon states who are enjoying the special status according to this treaty, and they have the legal obligation to be working toward the disarmament, but they haven't done it. They are not keeping their words. And so, if they're not going to do anything, then the rest of us have to stand up and take action. That spirit is so visible now, and I feel so hopeful. Catherine, would you like to add some more words?
Well, there's a new movement for nuclear disarmament, which is the ban treaty movement, and it's, as Setsuko says, these are non-nuclear weapon countries that are basically saying we are not going to wait for the step-by-step process of the NPT, and so there are 150 nations that have signed on to a humanitarian consequences initiative. And those nation states are working in conjunction with the International Committee for the Red Cross. And if you go to icrc.org, you will find research that has been recently conducted, which really speaks to the fact that we can't respond to a nuclear bombed city. There's no medical response, there's no social response, there's nothing that the state or medical community can do for a city on fire. I mean, if a nuclear bomb, a current nuclear bomb exploded over Manhattan, according to research done by Lynn Eden, again, look this up in the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, there would ensue a firestorm of a 50-mile radius and would affect the tri-state area. That's one bomb. There's no way we can respond to that. That would send the globe into chaos. There's research that's coming out of the University of Colorado that shows that fine particulate material from a nuclear bomb exploding in an urban area would drift into the troposphere and create a global climate chaos because of that particulate matter. I mean, it's insane. And so now the nations that don't have nuclear weapons are getting together, and this is really being driven by NGOs as well, the international community, International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, icanw.org. The idea is, like the landmines treaty, you don't wait for possessor nations to say, you know what, these weapons are bad, let's get rid of them. The countries that want to see a ban on nuclear weapons, very similar to how we created a ban on landmines, is that they said these weapons are immoral. They're illegal, they're immoral, they should be outlawed. And so the landmine treaty really delegitimized landmines. And so that is what brought about their demise. And yet we still have them buried around, and there's still a risk, but people aren't using them and aren't producing them, and they've been banned. And nuclear weapons are the only weapon of mass destruction that aren't banned. So that's where this momentum is going. That's why Setsuko is, speaking with such enthusiasm. She's been a keynote speaker at the last 2 international conferences on a ban treaty. Unfortunately, the media in this country doesn't talk about this. I mean, other countries there was just a huge conference in Vienna, and our government in the first International Humanitarian Consequences Conference didn't attend. The second one in Mexico, which Setsuko spoke about, they called it a distraction and said this is a distraction to disarmament. The third one in Vienna, they attended. And it's not a distraction. It's actually moving, and people are working towards this ban. And we believe that it's going to happen. It's going to happen quickly, because we have to move towards banning nuclear weapons. And it doesn't matter if the nuclear weapon states don't get on board. They will be forced by the countries of the world and by their citizens. You know, there's so many things that are happening that we don't know about. Read Kristen's book. It will blow your mind. Chernobyl at the moment is burning. There are forest fires around Chernobyl that are resuspending all of the radioactive materials, and nobody on our nobody's hearing about it in this country. I mean, it's madness. So I think that that's where the enthusiasm is coming from. We may not be hearing about it, but the rest of the world is engaged, and a lot of action is happening.
I have one final question, and I won't ask
Please.
You might be
Sorry, it doesn't seem to be on.
No, it's not on. It's okay.
Come here.
Yeah.
Come here.
Okay. In a perfect world, if this was all to end tomorrow, as far as the ban, if this was to happen, what would we do with all the chemicals, the plutonium and all that? How do we neutralize it, or where do you store it? Where does it go?
Well,
Well, can you hear me, or shall I speak into
I
the
can hear you
mic?
fine.
Is this working?
No.
see, technology.
Yeah.
You know, microphones can't even work.
Well, I'll just say briefly with respect to Rocky Flats, I mean, we don't have a solution for that. We don't have any safe long-term storage for radioactive waste. There are so many things to consider. It has to be a site that is geologically secure and stable. That means no floods, no earthquakes, you know, nothing. It has to be absolutely stable. Does such a site exist on this planet?
No.
No. And it also has to be culturally and politically secure. One thing, when you have materials that are as dangerous as plutonium and others like it that are dangerous for 24,000 years, that means it's dangerous for 500,000 years. You think about, how long has the United States been around? I mean, that means we have to come up with not only the storage, but the signs to say to future generations, cross-culturally, this is dangerous, don't touch this. And it's a very interesting linguistic argument. How do we create a sign? What language do we use? What symbol do we use? How do we protect this and keep it safe? And how do we communicate to future generations how dangerous it is? So the first thing is, as Governor Roy Romer used to say, who was governor of Colorado during the FBI raid, if we can't store it, stop making it. That's the first thing. You know, and number two, with respect to what we've made already, let's contain it and acknowledge it and recognize it and keep people away from it. Is in my own personal story with respect to Rocky Flats. That site should never open to the public. Now, beyond that, given all of the radioactive waste we have produced in this country and in other countries, we don't have a solution. I don't have a solution. I don't know what the solution is, but it's something that we have to deal with, and it's something that you will have to, it's you and your children and all of us. We need to decide what we're going to do with this. We can't afford to not look at it, to not face it.
So there's a concept called nuclear guardianship, and that is about looking after the material, we store it in a monitored, retrievable configuration so that it can be watched and it can be maintained. But as Kristen says, the first thing that we have to do is stop producing it. But there is, please look up nuclear guardianship. And Joanna Macy, there's a whole nuclear guardianship library of materials that you can, reading materials that you can look at. The fact is, we don't have a solution, but that's part of the liberation. We have to engage these materials. We have to engage our responsibility for them and create a culture of attention and care so that future generations can know what we are bequeathing them, and that we can look after this material to the best of our ability for measurable amounts of time, and then pass it to the next future generation, to the next generation. So nuclear guardianship. Please look that up. Okay. Yeah.
Well, I mean, just to say where to store this waste, I mean, we're already storing it in the Yucca Mountain in Nevada. We've hollowed out an entire mountain, feet and feet, hundreds of feet of rock, just to keep this radiation from escaping. And we're talking hundreds and upon thousands of metric tons. So if that's the solution so far, I mean, I guess that's all we have. It seems to be working, but it's not really that effective. I'm a geology major, so I know.
Yeah.
I deal with a lot of radioactive material.
Yeah.
Stuff. It's nasty, dangerous stuff. It is, and you know, even here we don't often have really the proper precautions to go about handling and dealing with it. Even though we are getting ores more so than anything else. So either way, it's still dangerous.
You can't hear. Okay. Yeah. So Yucca Mountain never opened. It was built, but it never opened. WIP, the Waste Isolation Pilot Plant in New Mexico, did open. It was meant to keep waste safe for 10,000 years, and 25 years later, it is leaking transuranic waste, that's plutonium-contaminated waste, from Rocky Flats that was taken to New Mexico, and that was due to a human error because of, they were told that they could only mix inorganic materials, and that was unfortunately read as organic, and this current leak was actually caused by the mixture of kitty litter into this radioactive material that caused one of the true packs to burst underground. I mean, it's like stranger than fiction. You can't make this stuff up. But the problem is when we bury it, we can't see what's going on. So even though the argument has been made, safe geological, deep geologic burial, first of all, there's too much stuff to bury. There's not the geologic stability, and I look to the NIREX inquiry for British nuclear fuels, look to what's happening at the Waste Isolation Pilot Project right now. Burying it means we're negating our responsibility. We're just giving it to the earth, and the earth is where we get our, our food and our air and our water. And Kristen's story is, when you read her book, you will see that once radiation escapes, you can't take it back. We've got to be able to find a way to take responsible care of this material in a monitored, retrievable manner so that we can watch it and so we can warn future generations and inculcate them into a responsible care culture. And it could be, as insane as it sounds, it could be the way that we really recognize our radical interdependence with all life. It could be that turning point for us, that this poison gives us that knowledge that we are all connected. The air, the water, the land is connected, and we have to keep the plutonium and the other hazardous and radioactive materials from contaminating our water, air, and earth. So in order to do that, we have to stop producing it, and we have to keep it in configured storage so that it can be monitored and watched.
But that's not really effective. That's thousands and thousands of years. The only thing shy of getting rid of it is maybe throwing it into an active volcano. It's so volatile, so hot, it'll just incinerate it. And regardless, it'll just turn it into base elements all over again.
Yeah, the problem with that argument is just sheer volume. It's just volume of materials. And again, read Kristen's book.
Is it the problem of storage of radioactive waste is a very complex problem. We don't yet have safe long-term storage for radioactive material. I don't think any country does at this point. But we certainly welcome people like you who are interested and care about the subject and can help us with it, because it's a problem that we need to solve. And we don't have an adequate solution yet, but I hope that we will.
You explained when you were talking about your book, the FBI read. What I didn't understand is the concept of the FBI raiding a base that was ran by the United States Department of Energy. Like, Could you explain that? Like,
Yeah.
how did the United States raid the United States?
I think I read that part twice.
Yeah, well, and I know that we are just about out of time, so I'm going to try to explain this in 30 seconds. We're okay. Yeah, it's an incredible story, isn't it? The way the raid came about was that there were two men in particular, FBI agent John Lipsky and EPA official William Stone. And they became aware, there had obviously long been suspicions about what was going on at the plant. People who worked at the plant began to leak information to the FBI. They knew that there was a lot of bad stuff on site and that things were contaminating the local neighborhoods and local environment. So they began to leak information to the FBI. In December of 1989, John Lipsky and William Stone took an airplane 3 times over the site at night, and they shot footage of the plant. I saw that footage personally, and it was chilling to me because you can see the infrared radioactive white streams on the ground emanating from the plant into local neighborhoods, including my neighborhood, including the canal that ran at the back of 6th. And as I said, it was a combined effort between the FBI and the EPA, and it was a surprise to the Department of Energy and Rocky Flats employees on site. It led to a 2-year grand jury investigation. It's a complex story. There were some people in Washington who knew about it, and that's an interesting part of the story. They had to know something about it, or the FBI agents would not have been allowed to even enter the gate, because at Rocky Flats, they had high security and they had tanks, and they were under command to shoot anybody who came on site. Now, I have to preface this by saying that my sisters and I and all our friends, it's a big site. We used to ride our horses around the site and sometimes crawl through the barbed wire fence and just see if we could get through. Fortunately, no one ever shot at us. We didn't fully understand what was at stake there. But those officials were those guards were under instructions to shoot on site. So they had enough information, and they had been led to believe that there was a conference, an FBI conference going on. So that was what allowed some of the agents to come in. But it's a complicated story. It's an incredible story. We could write a book. We could make a movie just about what happened on that particular day.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes, there.
Read it.
It's just a short question. But the place where you live by the Russian Falls, do you know if there are the new people moving in there, if they get information about what happened and about how dangerous it is?
That's a great question. What happens to people who move into the area? They do not get information. I showed you a picture very briefly, I was kind of rushing there, of the new homes that are being built around that site. The current situation is that there's no legal requirement for builders to inform home buyers that they are buying a home on contaminated land. And it's complicated. Plutonium, Colorado is the only state in the country that has an allowable level of plutonium in the soil. Plutonium tends to gather in hot spots. It doesn't distribute itself evenly. If a builder is building on contaminated land and they come across a hot spot, they are allowed to secretly or not so secretly plow that into the earth so that that hot spot is mitigated and mixed in with other soil so that they meet that minimum. So most people who buy houses out there, especially if they're coming from out of state, which many people are, Colorado and Denver is kind of a great place, to move to right now. Well, it always has been, really. People don't know, and it's been devastating for me every time I give a reading or a lecture in Colorado. Someone will come up to me and say, we just moved to Colorado from New York or California or Cincinnati or whatever, and we just bought a new house out there. I'm married, I'm here with my family, we have small children, and we just learned about what happened here, and we don't want to live here. We don't want to raise our children on contaminated soil. We don't want to take that risk, but we put our entire life savings into buying this house. And if we talk about how contaminated it is, no one will buy our house. We feel badly about selling the house to someone else without telling them what happened. But if we say anything, we won't be able to move. What do we do? And it's like the issue of radioactive waste. I have no answer for them. I don't know what the answer is. So that's why I think, that's one of the reasons why I think there's another lawsuit that's eventually going to happen. But the way it stands right now, builders are required to legally inform potential home builders of radon and other things, but they are not required to inform them of plutonium in the soil and other things like carbon tetrachloride and all of that, or the fact that they're buying a house directly adjacent to the most contaminated site in the United States.
I want to thank you guys so much. I have one final question that relates this both to the diversity of students in this class, both international and domestic. I want to ask you, well, first I want to ask you guys in this room, is this the first time you've really given this issue some thought in your lifetime? Just raise your hands. Okay. So some of these issues that we're talking about here do happen in New Jersey. We have a lot of sort of CAF land. We have a lot of contaminated radioactive land. I grew up near a Dow chemical plant. I later went to the one in Bhopal as well to see what happened there. But these are kind of realities that we don't talk about either. I want to ask you guys, are you seeing sort of our generation engage? Are you seeing them? Because this issue seems like it's so big, it can be so overwhelming. What do we do? How do we talk about solutions? I want to ask you and dare you to engage with the complexity of it, but I'd also like to ask you guys, are you seeing a new generation brave enough to take on this issue? And what does that look like?
Did you hear Let's go?
I think so.
Is there a new generation that's taking on this issue?
I have been encouraged these days, past few years, that more and more, well, I should say, I find it easier to approach young minds. They are more readily open and eager to learn what happened 70 years ago. I don't want them just to dwell there, but that's where the nuclear age started. And what has been happening in the past 70 years? Where are we at now? Which direction do we have to move? And that's the kind of talk I have been giving in schools and so on. And I am delighted that I find it easier to relate to, and they seem to be. I don't know why it is. Well, in Japan, of course, they have more interest in boards of education, give more, make more efforts, greater efforts to have the curriculum and train teachers so that they can teach the younger generation. But in America, I don't know, but in Canada too, the schools are doing very limited amount. I really feel that taxpayers are supporting the system. They should be taking the greater responsibility to help the young people to know what kind of world they are living in. Most of us are putting our heads in the sand, I think.
And I'll just add something real quick. I'm very encouraged, actually, and there's a new wave of activism at Rocky Flats. I showed you a couple of photos of people who are out there protesting now. And one of the things that I've had the honor of doing in the last year and a half or so is that more than 20 universities around the country have chosen my book for their Common Read first year experience programs. And so when that happens, an entire freshman class will read the incoming class will read my book, and then I will meet with different departments, students and faculty in different departments, everything from environmental studies to history, and of course the history students are interested in the history part of it and Cold War history. And then I'll meet with the biology and chemistry students, and we talk about, plutonium and how much is, safe or not safe, or, things like that, how much is in the soil. And even the psychology students who are interested in the psychological aspects of all of this. And then we have a dialogue about it, and we talk about ethics and the humanitarian aspect of the story. and putting a human face on what I feel is a very inhumane story. And so the response of all of those young people has really been overwhelming and very, very encouraging to me. And I think my generation, we couldn't talk about it. We didn't talk about Rocky Flats. We weren't allowed to talk about Rocky Flats. I wrote a book about the one thing I was not supposed to ever talk about. But the younger generation, they don't have that burden of secrecy and silencing. And I think they are ready to talk about it, nationally and I think internationally.
We have a gift for your center, which is Hibakusha Stories gets these, you all know the story of Sadako and the 1,000 paper cranes?
Yeah.
Well, this is 1,000 paper cranes folded by school students in Hiroshima. And because we don't often come to universities, we gave you a great big one. And so, Natalie, I'd like to give this to you from our project. And please remember Setsuko's story when you see those. And also, I have a copy of a film that I made, which is about nuclear weapons and nuclear power, and it's got a student guide in there, which describes this BB demonstration, so you know where the numbers came for that, and some kind of ideas about how students can take action for disarmament. So I think it's been a really rare opportunity for us to hear from both Kristen and Setsuko, the survivor. They're both survivors, you know, I mean, really. And both such powerful women that are so courageous to tell their story. And I hope that we'll also be hearing about Setsuko's prize in January from Sweden and Norway.
We also have small gifts for you on behalf of CGHR and Rutgers University, and we just so appreciate the time that you took to come out here and speak with our students. This is not even a class day, and the air conditioning's broken as of 4 o'clock this afternoon. So I want to thank you guys too for daring to come out, actually taking a chance to have interest in something that you're not necessarily required to do, and really starting to think about these issues. I think this is a great conversation, and we really are excited to have you guys back in the future. So thank you again.